Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third of 8 Grand Challenge Seminars 2023. The seminar today is titled Global Shortages in a Changing Climate, and we've brought together a panel of 4 experts who are going to tell you all about how the climate change is putting ever-increasing pressure on our food systems and on our water management. And what can we do both on a personal level and on a wider societal and policy level in order to, and on a research level, to have better food security and to manage droughts. So we're going to begin with some short presentations from each of the speakers. So could I invite, oh yes, so we have our 4 speakers today. We have Saeed from Wageningen Economic Research in the Netherlands. We have Bettina Lange from the Law Department here at the University of Oxford. We have Tom Thurkel from Cambridge and Eleanor Hammond from Oxford as well. So could you please give them all a warm round of applause? And I'd like to invite Saeed up first to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so I actually put a couple of slides together for an introduction. I'm actually trained as a mathematician. I got my PhD in economics, so in the current model. So I'm actually very keen to go into the results and show you all the details. But deliberately, I actually decided not to do that today. So I'm not going to show you anything with regards to projections with it or the results of model. Instead, I'm going to actually go through maybe also something related to the questions which I'm actually going to be discussing in panel discussion. So I'm from Wageningen University. That's very hard to pronounce. Wageningen is a very small town in the Netherlands, and is actually specialized in health, food, and agriculture. So even if you graduate in economics there, you actually do development economics there. Or if you mathematics, actually you do operations research and logistics. So it's really specialized in food, agriculture, and health and nutrition. So first slide is actually why I'm doing. Is actually about why I'm doing what I'm doing. So basically, we are going to talk about the challenges today and a lot of uncertainties that are actually ahead of us, which we don't know. Climate is one of them. Climate is not an uncertainty, the tipping point. When is going to happen? What extent is going to happen? That's an uncertainty. Or maybe some other things, when you're dealing with organization or, technological change or, unseen events. So what you do if you actually want to have a kind of come up with a design and an active policy, normally what you do is you try to actually have some sort of foresight. So this is where these two docs are actually talking, that they have some choices actually to make. And of course, that choice has to be made before that decision point, because past that decision point, there's no return. So it's very important that you stay there for a while and then think about possible future, and then maybe also take into account some other future, but basically you don't know, like, unseen dead end. And then, of course, to avoid, the probability that you become a crocodile lunch. So this is what is the essence of my research. So we actually try to actually look at, if we actually want to look at the food security, for example, in developing countries. I actually work a lot in developing countries. Then what you do actually, you want to have a set of uncertainty around the problem, and then you actually want to develop some scenarios, pathways towards the future. Okay, so what I do, so this is about what. So basically, we are a team. Normally, we work a lot with United Nations, FAO, and basically they are really expert in actually scope the process, map the food system, and then normally with the stakeholders and basically the local experts from this nation, from the countries under study, we do try to actually assess the trends and uncertainties. We construct scenario, and this is where my work is actually starts. So normally the scenarios in the form of narratives. So people actually talk about different future. You know, they might come up with some numbers, drop some numbers or not. But then we actually try to translate them into some basically quantitative numbers, and we'll put that also in the context. So if you actually go, so I've been working, for example, with the Dhaka metropolitan area to actually think about the food agenda 2041, and basically they don't think in the context of, for example, seeing a Dhaka metropolitan area in the global Bangladesh, in the global market, and then see what is happening around them. In order, and you cannot really isolate the problem. So normally we also come up with some contextual scenarios like, you know, population growth, climate change, etc. And then we actually, what we do with the model simulation, we actually look at the trade-off and synergies, and that's what is actually helpful next to just thinking about one pathways or the other scenario. Okay, so if you have this and that, if you want to have the food security and nutrition future for Bangladesh, what about the emission? Because agriculture is responsible for 45% of the total greenhouse gas emission produced in Bangladesh. So this, and then of course, hopefully that would be used by the policymakers to design the policy. And this is also one of the discussions for the panel, whether we are successful in delivering that or not. Okay. And then I'm not going to go through details, but normally we actually look at this macro perspective on the demand side and the supply side, but I'm an economist. So for that, I'm actually normally I for the agriculture and food, I really focus on the demand. But of course, for example, you know, you actually going to think about the future of Bangladesh in terms of the change in the diet, because Bangladesh becomes a middle-income country. I'm giving you the example of Bangladesh because that's one of the countries which is going to be really hit by climate change. And basically they are moving again towards what is called high-income diet, which basically consumption, more consumption of processed food and meat, and it's definitely not sustainable. And what does that mean if that diet changes? Of course, Bangladesh is also going to be a middle-income country. Population in Bangladesh is really fast-growing population, one of the most fast-growing population, and also the rate of urbanization. So if you put all together, what does that mean about the demand of food? And then, of course, that demand should be responded partially by domestic market, partially by import. And of course, we actually look at what is realistic, and normally we actually use some values to actually see under the climate condition and heat stress, what are the possibilities for production, domestic production, and to what extent they have to rely on imports. And then, of course, food security is a concept which is not only at the national level, but you have to really think about different households and different income that have access to food. So that's why we actually also use household surveys in order to actually see what does that mean, each of the indicators mean for different type of households. So this is a recent paper. We actually have a low carbon hunger-free future for Bangladesh, where we actually did an excellent assessment, and there's some colleagues also from the Environmental Change Institute from Oxford. Actually, we're responsible for really working on development of the scenarios, and then we did the quantification. And basically, there are also two main products, because here I call it science policy interface, because what we do actually in Wageningen, we try also to, especially what I do, is not only doing the research and science, but also making sure that it has impact. And we get back to that discussion later, you know, to how we're going to change this, you know, model of linear relationship between science and policy into some sort of co-creation or co-production. But the result was we actually helped the Bangladesh government actually to actually help to support them with two plans under the change in the climate. One is a food agenda for 2041, and the other one is because Bangladesh is a big delta, is a Delta Plan 2100, which basically is a really long-term plan in Bangladesh. Yeah, this is just snapshots because what we do is also, I mean, well, there's this link. This is basically normally we publish our results in the paper plus a dashboard. So that basically, if you are interested in more results, you can actually go to the dashboard. This is the dashboard. This is the snapshot of the dashboard, and this where we can actually see there are some choices you can make from different scenarios or trends, etc. You actually see you can see some of the results of the model for different region in Bangladesh. Okay, so we are a large team within Wageningen University. I'm from Wageningen Academic Research. This is the Research Institute, and then we are actually a large kind of a team of modelers, a magnet team, and basically we have coming from different disciplines. We actually try to work on the maintenance and extension of this magnet model, which basically I'll show some of the results. So I'm going to stop here, and then hopefully some of these topics can actually pick up in the panel discussion. Okay.
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. Up next, we have Bettina Lange.
Right. Good afternoon. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. What I want to do in this very brief introduction is to say a few things about a particular perspective on understanding and hopefully as well tackling global shortages, a social legal approach. And I want to make a case for that in the context of some examples in relation to drought and water scarcity. So the hallmark really of this approach is to be skeptical about the capacity of law to really change the behavior as well of individual and corporate actors. And hence it's an approach that is interested as well in understanding how sometimes environmental law actually can create problems in the first instance and as well create shortages. So sometimes that can happen in very direct ways. For example, when environmental regulators who exercise powers under discretionary legal rules, for example, for granting abstraction licenses for access to water utilities, to industrial abstractors, to farmers when they exercise these powers, that they allocate more water than there's actually need for in the economic production process. And so in England and Wales, we see, for example, that 12% of license holders abstract less than half of the allocated volume, 17% abstract less than 3/4 of the allocated volume. But then environmental law as well sometimes can contribute to creating environmental problems as well in more indirect and in more insidious and less transparent ways, nevertheless important. And the particular example that I've just put up there on the slide is Section 73 from the Water Resources Act 1991, which actually talks about the use of drought orders, a particular tool for managing water shortages and drought. And that contains an implicit definition of drought. It says that, well, this is about an exceptional shortage of rain, which exists or threatens serious deficiency of supplies of water. So here the legal text prompts us to think about droughts as something that is caused by natural forces, the exceptional shortage of rain. It does recognize to some extent that there's an intervening variable, that it must cause a serious deficiency of water, which means that how we actually govern as societies our water resources and not just the rainfall itself will have an impact as well on whether we actually experience water shortage. So this is steering and making us think that exceptional shortage of rain is really a main cause, and we may want to think whether how much that is really the appropriate way of putting it. So it raises the question really how we translate nature into law, and it's becoming a particular issue as well during the Anthropocene, where we have to recognize, I think more than we do, that human actions have very significant impacts on water resource availability. And the second feature of the social legal approach is to say, well, law does not just exist in the statute book and in judicial decisions, but law in action, the living law is really important. And a classic study in the field found, for example, that water pollution control inspectors interpreted a strict liability offense as including an element of negligence and practice, because they were reluctant to charge water polluters if there were, for example, small and medium-sized companies who didn't have quite the technological know-how for controlling pollution, or if they thought that the pollution incident was just a one-off, they wouldn't charge with the offense. So just to illustrate a little bit more in the context of peer studies, I've been working on a study with Dr. Mark Shepard that was interested to understand what an economic right to water means from a farmer's perspective. So economic right meaning using water for productive purposes. And what we found is that farmers did consider themselves as stewards of water courses, but that actually the economic organization of the farm and green production and consumption standards were more important than the institutional legal framework of the obstruction licensing system in impacting farmers' approach to water use. A second study in which I've been working on with Dr. Kevin Bretsch and Dr. Christina Kück asks the question about how is really environmental science evidence mobilized and regulators' legal decision for drought governance in the UK. And so one of the things that we found is that we thought there's limited instrumental direct impact from environmental science on legal decisions, and that instead a complex picture is emerging where sometimes the environmental science is having an impact on legal decisions, but of course the legal rules as well steer what environmental science is generated in the first instance, what environmental science is translated and can inform legal reasoning. And an example of that is that we have, for example, no clear requirement in English law for having strategic environmental impact assessment for the drought plans of water companies. And finally, I've been involved in work with the Rivers Trust as well that thought through about how to put into practice some of the findings. And so we are suggesting that we should have more flexible entitlements to water, where we say there should be a sliding scale approach. Currently, a range of obstructors are very strongly protected through rights to compensation as well, if one wants to claw back water allocations. And we're saying, well, there's been lots of discussion how we can as well potentially increase access to water through trading. And we are saying the very interesting examples as well for non-financial exchanges, bartering, where, for example, farmers would use pesticides and fertilizer use in exchange for water utility, giving them some extra allocation. And I think that's my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up is Tom Thurple.
Okay, thank you. Bit of introduction. I'm a researcher at the Oxford Science Centre in Cambridge, and I'm going to be talking today about optimising microbial symbiosis for sustainable agriculture. First of all, it's really important to reiterate, I think, that we are kind of hooked on synthetic inputs to maintain agricultural output that we have at the moment. So about half the world's population is completely reliant on industrially produced fertilizers. And that's great. It's pretty convenient, but it comes with a whole load of downsides. So obvious one of climate change, carbon emissions for producing these chemicals. We are increasing the nutrition of the soil, and so we've got local and wider implications of that in terms of the ecological effects. When that gets really bad, we get toxic effects, so dead zones in the sea, we get changes to population and community structures. And the bottom right, this is a graph of historic phosphorus output from mines. Phosphorus fertilizer can't be produced in the way that nitrogen can from the air. You have to dig it up from rich phosphorus rock, and the sources of that are running out. So we're approaching this peak phosphorus situation where soon we're not going to have any of that left, and we need to find other ways of adding phosphorus to our crops. So the race is on to try and find out how we feed the world. And it's a really exciting time because there's a lot of movement in sort of rethinking soil, what it is. Previously, it's been seen, I think, as a bit of a container in which you can grow plants, and it just keeps them upright, somewhere to put them. More people are seeing it as the primary nutrient source for their crops. So what nutrients can we get out of the soil? What can we do with the soil to get the most out of it before we need to then add additional fertilizer. I think fertilizer is always going to have to be added, bagged fertilizer, industrial fertilizer, because when we're harvesting, we're taking nutrition away. That has to be replaced. And I'm going to try and convince you these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are fantastic and interesting. Exchange structures you can see stained in blue on the right hand side there, and then they grow out all through the soil as well, and they forage nutrients, exchange them for plant carbon, and they're really important because they're absolutely everywhere. They're in all arable soils. All of the top 10 crops around the world rely on this symbiosis to get their nutrition. 100% plant phosphorus uptake, and they make large contributions to nitrogen. So it's often said plants don't have roots, they have mycorrhizas. Weirdly then, they've been totally ignored in plant breeding until very, very recently. They're doing all of this stuff, but plant breeders just don't seem to care. Should point out, they have a load of other benefits as well as nutrient uptake. So they can improve a plant's defense response to pests and pathogens. They can improve water use efficiency. And I think most importantly for this group, soil rich in these fungi can have lower greenhouse gas emissions. But what do? I think to optimize this sort of these symbioses, we need the right genes in the right crops and in the right soil. I think Steve mentioned the importance of context. I think that plays into this as well. So sort of starting at the left-hand side on the right genes, the group I work in have found that we've got good control by gene editing, genetic modification for mycorrhizal traits, so we can change the amount of fungus that are in these roots, the extent to which the plant engages in this interaction with the fungi. Those genes, once we've got the right genes, have to be in the right plants, because not all plants respond to these fungi in the same way. They've got all these benefits, but for some reason we don't know, plants don't always see those benefits. So some crop varieties, these fungi are parasitic on them for some reason, they reduce the growth and yield. Other ones, hugely beneficial. We need to make sure we're working in the varieties that get benefit. And then all of this needs to be in the right soil. So we need to manage our soil in a way that supports abundant and diverse microbial communities. And this means not tilling it really intensively every year to smash up all of the lovely microbial communities there. Not drenching it in fungicide, pesticide, herbicide, and so on, so that we can have, as I say, the genes in the plants, in the soils, and hopefully then reduce that demand for fertilizer. That's me done.
Thank you very much, Tom. And now we have Eleanor.
Okay. Hi, I'm Eleanor Hammond, and I'm a research assistant in the biology department here. And my research focuses on how can we calculate and communicate an individual or organization's food-related environmental impacts. So my first slide is, why is it important to communicate to an individual and organization their food-related environmental impacts? So study estimated that we could reduce our global food-related environmental impacts. Different studies, different estimates, but from 50 to 80% through food system transformations. And obviously shifting towards more sustainable diets is part of this. So that kind of makes the case that if we can effectively calculate and communicate the impacts of our food consumption to individuals and organizations, then this will kind of help in our shift towards more sustainable food systems. So the graph on the right here is to try and illustrate the kind of, I guess, the theory of change behind this whole thing about communicating impacts. So if an individual or organization was able to be informed of their baseline, food-related environmental impacts, then they would be able to set food-related environmental targets in specified timeframes, so smart targets, measurable, achievable, and then if they were able to understand which cumulative sets of actions would enable them to meet those targets over time, that would then enable enable them to cumulatively reduce their impact. And if they could track their progress over time, then maybe we could actually achieve some goals. So this kind of framework is it's the mitigation hierarchy, I guess. So there's something called the mitigation and conservation hierarchy, which is the mitigation hierarchy, which you're probably well aware of, which has been used in many sectors like mining and fisheries. So you can kind of understand your impacts, mitigate them, and then sort of the conservation part is then going further than just mitigating your impacts and actually like adding on positive impacts for biodiversity, carbon, whichever environmental metrics. So you can actually move towards net positive outcomes. So that's the idea behind this. So my research is trying to work out how we can apply this mitigation and conservation hierarchy in the context of the food system on the level of an individual or organization's food consumption to kind of inform how we can move towards food outcomes. So the kind of overall things that we need to be able to do this is, first of all, ingredient composition for multi-ingredient food products. So lots of people have probably heard of life cycle assessments. That's that's the methodology that's widely used for calculating the environmental impacts of agricultural commodities from quite often it's from like cradle to farm gate. So accounting for post-production like packaging, transport is a bit more difficult, but I think it's a bit less transparent. But cradle to gate life cycle assessment of agricultural commodities, then if you can combine that with back of packet ingredient information for like multi-ingredient food products, you can then start to build a picture of what are the environmental impacts of multi-ingredient food products, because data is quite widely available on the impacts of agricultural commodities. But in terms of communicating this to organizations and individuals, most of the foods that we eat aren't just like wheat or soy, like we eat biscuits or like something with those in it, but it's not particularly useful to have to like break down your food shop into like how much wheat have, like, so it's not very helpful. Well, it is helpful, but we could do it in a more helpful way. So combining those two pieces of information is like the premise for making the big multi-ingredient food product database. And then if we were able to combine that database with information from an individual or an organization's like food purchasing and match up like the best matches. So currently you could do this like manually. So it's been done for like an Oxford College as a proof of concept. So I'm now trying to do this in an automated way so that it's not like you have to wait for a month for someone to manually crunch the numbers and give you a report. Like if it was going to be in a usable format, it would be like an app or an online tool. So it needs to be like quick. Then you could, oh, it's a bit blurry, but like then you could break down the impacts from an individual or an organization into like, you can kind of see on the left here, this is like different food categories. So like it says it's in alphabetical order, like beef, cereals, cheese, chocolate. Like you could break it down however many different ways you want, but then you can, and on the top is like greenhouse gas emissions, land use, scaled water use, etc. So you could start to see what are my environmental impacts, and then after that you could think about it. Oh yeah, so after that, the options for what we can do with this information is there's quite a lot in terms of actually then communicating it to people so that people can start to make more informed decisions. So for example, you could use that for eco labels and like swap suggestions on a recipe. So again, I don't know if that's blurry, but for example, like you could have a particular recipe, give it an eco label, so that could be A, B, C, D, E, or some other way of communicating the impacts. You could then, there's like a part on the right that says if you swapped out the prawn for tofu, this would reduce the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions by 77%, would make this recipe an A. So that kind of thing, you could try and help people to like understand those kind of things. Or maybe on an individual and organization level, you could come up with a set of strategies that individuals or organizations could follow that would then cumulatively enable them to meet their targets. So for example, if you were to, it says swap beef to poultry by X%, it's a bit blurry, but this would reduce your impacts by X%. So with this information, we could like kind of inform people basically, and that could help us move towards more sustainable outcomes. And then just the last point is the challenges associated with this. So I'll probably, hopefully be able to expand on it in the panel, but one massive one is the need for like openness and transparency in data, because quite a lot of back of packet food ingredient information is quite like opaque, and supply chain information is opaque for various reasons. Like there are people that like don't want people to know where things are coming from or what's in things. So that really does not help when you're trying to build up a big database or understand where people's food's coming from. And then just things like better understanding through like behavioral trials and things like how can we better encourage consumer sustainable food decisions. And then this is like a whole like another kettle of fish, but like when you're actually trying to move towards like net zero or net positive for biodiversity, part of it is offsetting, and that's just like a whole unknown, like does it even work, so that's very important if we're actually going to move towards positive outcomes. But so, yeah.
Thank you very much. But I'm sure that you're all thrilled by how interesting all those talks are. We're now going to move on to the panel discussion. This will have two parts. First, there will be a couple of questions from the chair, but I'm very keen to open up the floor quickly for people in the audience. And as we're running a little behind schedule, I think I'm going to ask just a couple of questions and then we'll open it up for people to ask their own questions. So can you please invite the panel onto the floor? Great, thank you very much. So I think the first thing, and something that probably people here are really keen to find out about, especially given the name of the seminar series, is what is one key grand challenge related to either agriculture, food sustainability, or drought management that you think every single person in this room should be aware of after they leave the seminar? And perhaps we can start with Saeed.
Okay, so the grand challenge. What is the grand? Climate change is around the corner. We don't know where it's going to be. A tipping point is going to be tomorrow. I remember the IPCC report from 2018. They would actually set a kind of a deadline. If you don't do anything, if you want to do something about climate change, you have to do it within 12 years. Even if some people said 12 months back then. 12 years means 2030, otherwise, we cannot save the planet. But there are a lot of uncertainties about that. But what is important is actually the interaction and unfortunately destabilizing feedback loop between the climate change and what is actually happening in the world. Now, I'm just giving you an example of the country I just showed as a case study. So, if you look at Bangladesh, it's a big delta, and it's actually that area, especially Bangladesh, is going to really be hit really hard by climate change. Already, if we actually look at some simulation, but they actually show that by 2050 there will be an increase of temperature increase by 2 to 3 degrees, 2 to 2.5 degrees there. And then the area which is going to be heat, the heat stressed area is actually going to increase by 20 to 30%. That means that there will be a shorter season for rice production. It means that people actually there, if you look at their diet, they mainly consume rice. 70% of their diet is composed of rice. And basically the shortage of rice is a disaster. Now put this next to the fact that Bangladesh population is increasing. Put that next to the fact that there's a really large rate of urbanization in Bangladesh, especially in the Dhaka metropolitan area. I think Dhaka is going to be one of the largest metropoles by 2041. Basically, the challenge is not only climate change. Challenge is actually things are not moving offsetting each other's impact. Actually, the other is a country. The country is actually thing is actually not moving in the direction to stabilize the system. It's actually destabilizing the system more and more. So pushing towards that tipping point that exists. So this is one. And the other thing is actually, if you look at the policy side, when you, the problem is actually some of these policies are really greedy. Again, an example from Dhaka, they actually talk about rooftop gardening. Well, it's an excellent idea. I mean, if you get rooftop gardening, basically you say, okay, in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, for example, we don't have enough green space, so rooftop gardening, not only more food, basically more nutritious food, so there will be an increase in intake of vegetables and fruits. And it's also going to absorb some carbon. It's also going to insulate the roof, so basically increase the heat, so the buildings can actually be cooled down quickly. So there's a lot of positive things about just rooftop gardening. And they actually started to implement that. They also created a kind of tax incentive in order to encourage it. But then actually, if you look at the scale after all this investment, basically we're talking about, for example, the houses in a slum part of Bangladesh, they cannot really, they don't have the capacity for that roof gardening. And if you look at the buildings which basically can, potentially this can be done there, we're actually talking about only a share of 0.4% increase in the production of vegetables for today's consumption, right? So basically, this is also another thing where basically, if you look at the policy, some of the measures actually they're taking is really greedy. And if you look at, for example, the actual commitment of Bangladesh towards cutting the emission is also very, very small in terms of the commitment they have to this IEDC and NDC for climate change. So basically, so I cannot really name one challenge, but for me it's a kind of a system where basically things actually are triggering each other and they are not moving in the right direction. So we cannot probably solve the problem of climate change, but there are some social aspects and economic aspects or behavioral aspects which actually can be changed in order to make sure we can adopt properly and mitigate properly.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bettina, do you have any thoughts?
Thank you. Yes, yeah, I want to pick up on the point as well that Ellen was making about the importance of having knowledge about one's own impact. And I think that's something that resonates as well very much in the water use context. So in the United Kingdom, we are seeing a move to increasingly installing water meters into domestic premises so that we all know a bit more kind of what impact we're having and how much water we're using. So I think water metering is very important. I also think that in the current climate, it's important to consider the distributional consequences of policies like this. And so I think it's important to consider social tariffs in connection with a move to water metering, because for quite a few households, the installation of a water meter means a high cost than they were occurring under the flat rate being charged by the water company. And the second point very briefly is that I think in the debates about how we can best adapt to changing climate as well, some of the solutions will be sort of the more large infrastructure, technological solutions that become very relevant as well in the context of drought risk. But I think it's really important to be cautious about the promise of the technology fix and the discussions around drought as well. I think the importance of nature-based solutions, and in particular where the changing climate is leading to increasing frequency and intensity of alternating events such as flooding and drought, to think about nature-based solutions as well for water storage.
Yeah, Tom, speaking of nature-based solutions, I'm sure that you've got quite a few suggestions there, but what are the current challenges in the work that you do?
I would say one of the main challenges that I've seen is the kind of keeping the mindset that everything is really connected and everything has got consequences beyond what you might have read up on most. So the neonicotinoid pesticides, which I think it's been fairly well established are terrible for bees, loads of beneficial insects, were really important for controlling stem flea beetle in oilseed rape and other brassicas. The ban means that a lot of farmers now just don't bother growing those crops because they can't, because the losses you incur from
the pest mean that you don't get a crop at the end of the year. Okay, so that may affect then the supply and price of that crop. And then with climate change, you've got other pests and diseases coming from, which we were isolated from previously because we've got a cooler maritime climate. As it warms up or it gets wetter or drier or whatever, we have new diseases coming in, and how we control those without hugely adversely affecting something further down the line or something back upstream. We just need to be aware of that.
Sure, thank you very much, Tom. And what about you, Eleanor? What sort of the grand challenges in the work that you...
Yeah, so I'm not sure, I mean, I don't know if this is like the grandest challenge in the whole picture, but definitely in the work that I do, one of the, and I already alluded to it, one of the grand challenges is data. So I've kind of like broken this down into 3 different types. So like data availability. So one is the transparency in supply chain information, as I was saying before. So if you're trying to inform consumers or organizations on the environmental impacts of their foods and how they can reduce these, then the opaqueness in the supply chains is really a big challenge. Because if you're not sure where your food's coming from, how can you make more informed decisions? There might be unintended consequences of going for a specific supply chain that you don't know because you don't know where it's come from. So related to that, there's initiatives that are trying to kind of shed light on this. So there's one called Trace with an S, not C, and they're trying to kind of unlock the supply chains for tropical, that are related to tropical deforestation, so beef, soy, coffee, palm oil, I think are the main ones, and to therefore, like, I think they're working with governments, big corporations, so that they can understand where their products are coming from, and then therefore like make decisions about whether they change that. And then the second type of data availability that's a bit of a challenge is the resolution in empirical, like farm level data, because these life cycle assessments rely on empirical data that's collected on the farm, which then are kind of parameters for models that then model like midpoint impacts, which then they feed into models that enable us to kind of estimate endpoint indicators, for example, biodiversity loss or like global warming from those farm like production practices. But so part of my research is like using Oxford colleges as a case study of like catering organisations, and sometimes caterers ask me, well, if I got like lamb from up the road, like what would the impacts of that be versus what your kind of calculations are telling me based on like global averages or based on assumptions about that production system, because we don't have the data from that particular farm. We have to try and make assumptions so we get as accurate a value as possible, but it's not obviously going to be the impact. So there's initiatives, like there's one in Oxford, it's like Login 5 Farm Sustainability Toolkit, where they're trying to like have digital tools so that farmers can like input empirical data that then goes into big like life cycle assessment databases. So that's like up and coming, but it's a challenge at the moment because we need the resolution of data on the farm level to match with the resolution of data with like supply chain transparent information, so like get more of an accurate picture. And then the last one is publicly available data. So like availability of backpack ingredient information and things like that just allows us to again build up much more of an accurate picture. But it's quite hard to get that at the moment. So for example, if you scrape supermarket websites, like it's all available. You can kind of look at supermarket websites, but there's massive licensing restrictions on how you collect that information, and that prevents like big databases to build up impact information. So just wanted to use this time to like draw attention to one really cool resource which I found, which is called Open Food Facts, and I think they're based in France, and they're a big like kind of public like crowd sourcing data gathering initiative where individuals like scan or take pictures of supermarket products, upload them, then the information is like transcribed. So it's a way to like get around licensing restrictions, because that's like a non-restricted way of collecting information. So anyone can like go on their website and
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Anna. I'm definitely going to. What was the name of that?
Open food facts.
Open food facts. I'm definitely going to take a look at that later. Okay, so we have about another 5 minutes of questions from me, and then we'll open up to questions from the floor, because I'm very eager to hear what you all have to ask. I'm just going to ask you a couple of quick fire questions now. I want to rate you to rate these things from a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is bad and 10 is very, very good. The very first question is going to be, how much of an impact can people have as an individual? And all I want you to say is a number from 1 to 10. So if you think that individuals doing whatever has absolutely 0 impact, say 1. And if you think that individuals can completely solve climate change by themselves, then say 10.
Okay, I think 6.5.
I was going to say 7.
I'm going to say between 7 and 8.
8.
How fast do you think policy is at responding to new scientific discoveries? So 1 being very slow, 10 being immediate.
2.
Yeah, 2.5. And the challenges, we need good communication between the scientists and people who draft the legal texts, because the challenge often is that the legal drafter and courts, when they express opinions about what is the science that should be considered, was there adequate scientific risk assessment, the courts have their own ways of reproducing kind of what is good environmental science evidence and their problems to set. So, yeah.
I'm going to cheat and say 2 numbers. I'm going to say for some things 2 and for some things 8.
Yeah, I think I'd probably echo that based on like understanding things from my lab group, and I think just in terms of like, for example, policy brief is one way that science can get into policy, but there seems to be a bit of a like discrepancy between what the scientist maybe thinks would be the best points to put in there, and then what the policymaker, like in their limited time, can actually digest and kind of implement. So it's a bit of a barrier to.
Yeah. Very quickly, how effective do you think genetically modified organisms are for crop sustainability?
Okay, I don't know a whole lot about this, but in terms of like reducing yield gap, I think it could be a really increasing agricultural production without having detrimental impacts on the environment, so that we can kind of not expand agricultural land use. From what I understand, it could be quite effective, so I'm going to say, well, I don't know, 6, 7.
I'd say all the time that they're properly regulated, they have to be part of the solution. It would be mad not to include them. So 10.
I'm going to sit on the fence because I can't express a scientific view on how effective it is. I'm going to say 5, and echo the view that from a legal perspective, procedures are key. If you want to create public acceptance, which I think is important, then we need good public consultation procedures. I think we need the full risk assessments. Just release notices are, I think, problematic.
I think in terms of food security, 10, because it increases the availability of food. It also increases the quality, because then you can have different nutrient composition, better engineered nutrient composition. It can also affect access to food, because the increase, I mean, they have some studies showing that it increase the smallholder farmer income by 60%. And so the access to food is also reduced. So it's the availability, accessibility, and then, of course, in terms of environmental aspects also was mentioned, so basically land use, and of course the yields is increased by 22%, and the use of pesticides, of course, for certain plants, so certain crops. So it's all good, except that we don't know if there will be health consequences, and people are a little bit concerned about that. Well, that's all about any technology which actually not good.
And the very last thing, should we all become vegan? Yes or no?
I would say yes. Yes. I mean, that's, yeah. I mean, if we look at how expensive, and when I'm saying expensive, I'm not talking about market price, because externalities are not included in the market price, because it spills also the market. meat is really, animal protein or animal based food are really expensive for our future. That's become a vegan. I think that's future.
So I think it must be a matter of free choice, but it's clear in terms of it's nearly twice the amount of water that needs to go to producing the food for a meat-based diet that goes into for a vegetarian diet even. So from a water scarcity perspective, I think the choice is clear, and also there are very significant public health benefits from eating a vegetarian or vegan diet.
Yeah, I think we probably should, but I really want to. But I don't think we have to. I don't think everybody has to go vegan to get enormous benefits of reduction in meat and dairy and these sorts of things.
Yeah, I think the word should is quite loaded, and obviously that's got like sort of cultural health, like livelihood, trade considerations, but in terms of the environmental argument for it, it's quite clear or like, yeah. So I've just got some facts to hand. So in 2018, a study kind of estimated that if globally we shifted to a vegan diet, our land use would decrease by 75%, from 4 to 1 million hectares, greenhouse gas emissions down 49%, eutrophication potential down 49%, and scarcity scale of water use down 19%. So obviously that's like estimated through models, but it's just a bit of an idea of the potential. But as you said, it's not like a black or white fix. I think it's not like, well, I eat meat or I'm vegan. Like there's such a scale in the middle. So any shift towards that will have a big impact. So for example, the Eat Lancet Planetary Health Diet does not suggest going vegan, but it's like highly plant-based. So it's not like if I can't go vegan for maybe other reasons like health, then I might as well not try at all, because that's not the case. It's like anything.
It's probably less so in this room, but
Yeah.
in a lot of the world, it's just not going to work that you could import food from wherever to get vitamin B12, protein. Yeah, I don't think it's necessary.
Unfortunately, I forgot to book us into a vegan restaurant. We're going somewhere else. It's not a vegan place, I'm afraid. Great, so thank you very much. Now, I'd love to open up the questions from the audience. So, does anyone have any questions? Perhaps Sophia, do you want to take the working microphone?
Yeah, I've just turned it off and it's working.
Great, okay, so sorry, do we have any questions? Yeah, there's one over there.
Firstly, thank you very much for the talks. That was really interesting. My question is on what's your assessment of kind of the British or Dutch government policy on food at the moment relating to this big challenge, and what are some government initiatives that you think of that they aren't doing now that they could do to address this challenge?
So on the particular point that we've sort of touched upon as well about gene editing for food production, the importance of thinking about innovative technologies, I think the difficulty is sort of the knock-on effects potentially as well. So if one wants to support as well organic agriculture, then one really needs to think about the risk of cross-contamination, about the potential costs for potential actions for the organic farmer who might have food contaminated by other types of production. So coherence in the policy is really important, and there are tricky issues around wanting to harness new technologies while also supporting organic food.
We should, I mean, I'm not specialized in Dutch policy. I'm actually more working with developing countries where the food and nutrition security is a big challenge, but of course, sustainable agriculture is a problem now in the Netherlands, because for years, also Wageningen University is guilty of, focusing on basically more production and waiting for more growth and getting yields, of course, good intentions, but of course ended up, having really bad environmental impact, especially now in the Netherlands. And now the problem is, of course, in order to create, incentive for farmers to adopt sustainable agriculture and has becoming a really big issue, not only in the Netherlands, but especially in the Netherlands, also in France and Belgium. And of course, that's also a discussion by itself. But then, good challenge is actually how they're going to do that, because of course, the short-term incentives and voluntary actions for farmers are what they want, but of course the society and government, they really want some sort of long-term and also compulsory regulation and environmental laws, and that's really a big issue right now. But I don't have an answer for that. That's a challenge. That's something as a researcher interested to see, how this trade-off or conflicts of interest, can be solved.
I'll just very quickly say, I think it's another problem of trade-offs where what works at one end of the country is not going to work at the other end of the country. There's hundreds of different farming models where government has to make a decision and say, this is our policy on this. That's going to put some farmers into bankruptcy. So I'm glad I'm not a policy maker, I don't have to make that sort of decision. But it's just something that has to be considered, I guess.
Slightly different note, but just on the point of what the kind of UK policy can do, so going about data again, but for example, the government could have quite a key role to play in promoting more open data. So there's something called the UK Food Data Transparency Partnership, which has been launched in response to the Dimbleby National Food Strategy. So it could be quite an exciting time for more consistent company reporting, or consistent measurement, standardization of impact metrics. So that's quite exciting.
Great. Do we have any more questions? Yes, the blonde woman.
Can I just shout?
It might be better to get it on the microphone for the live stream.
Thank you. I have a question specifically to Eleanor, but maybe the other people want to say something about it too. I really like the idea of an eco-label for products, and I think you're not the only group that is working on ideas on how that could look like. However, I often have the feeling that you already touched upon it, that data availability is a really big thing, and you're at the moment working with a lot of assumptions. I never really see how something is produced that is confident in such eco-labels. We always have, okay, cereal has this carbon output or something, or another product has this carbon output, and that's why we should replace it. Tofu is always better, for example. And I think a good example for this is, for example, palm oil. In the last couple of years, we always start to see more and more this black and white picture that palm oil can only be bad for all of the indices that we have. But there are ways, organic production, conservation agriculture, how you produce, how the inputs are, where you produce. Palm oil, for example, can have a net positive impact, but then in models like yours, and I'm not blaming it on you, it always has negative impact, because most of the palm oil that is produced probably does that, but then people start shifting away from palm oil, even though it could be one of the most sustainable oil production sources. Do you understand the problem?
Yeah, so you kind of say, I guess, with the assumptions we're making, we're kind of having to go on global average impacts.
Yeah.
And an eco-label would really capture the nuance in what actually has gone into that particular product. And so then maybe it could actually incentivize the wrong choices, kind of things. Yeah, exactly. You've touched on this really important point, which is, if you have to use global average impacts, which quite often we do because we don't know exactly what supply chain things have come from, there is the risk that you don't quite capture the impacts of that product properly, which then goes back to the whole data availability thing. If you could actually trace exactly where that particular product, which might have palm oil, has come from, you could then have a much better idea of
well, is this sustainable palm oil, is it not, or how sustainable is this sustainable palm oil, because there's probably like even differences in that. So I think, yeah, that's, I think the kind of consensus at the moment is that probably on the whole, providing people with information if it's global averages is probably better to start with, to try and start shifting people to even just start thinking about things, even if there's always assumptions in science, like there's never really a case where you don't have to assume something to make it data that's actually communicable, because otherwise like it will just be so complicated and not like you can represent it in like a single number that someone, or letter that someone could just look at in a supermarket. So I think, yeah, that's a really good point. And eco-labels is such like a fine balance, or just even communicating impacts in like an easy to understand way, because it needs to be for a layperson to understand as well. It's such a fine balance between communicating enough information so that you're not just like brushing over everything in such broad strokes that it's just not useful at all, and but then doing it in a way that like it's not like super complicated, it's something that people can quickly look at. But I think, yeah, a big part is if we were able to get, life cycle assessment tells us that for some products there's a huge variation in the impacts from like beef is an example, like I think, I can't remember exactly the statistic, but quite a large proportion of beef that's consumed is actually like dairy fed beef, and that can be 60% lower emissions. So that then means if you're looking at a graph of like the impacts of beef globally, some beef production is really high, and that tends to be like beef that's bred for like eating. But there is like a large impact, so a large variation in the impacts, and that's the same in quite a lot of different agricultural commodities. Some might be more narrow, so just capturing it to global average does overlook some information. So yeah, if we had more high resolution information to put on an eco-label, that would be better. But I think we're a long way off, so using global averages for now, I think people are thinking that's probably better than nothing. That was
Yeah, I think the point is well taken. I think eco-labels can be a great thing. The European Commission won the early one on energy efficiency. They did evaluation studies, the Commission, and that had positive impacts. So there's some evidence that they can work. I think it would be good to have it for water. I share your concerns about the complexity in those. And there's a particular issue, I think, as well with the water impact for food products, about virtual water. So not all water is equal, but particularly where the water is being used in an area that's already water scarce to grow the product that we then consume here, raises the issue again, sort of about distribution issues. But I think it's really exciting, important stuff to work on, and to promote labeling as one way of still having as well choice in some ways in terms of the regulatory strategy. And I think that can be as well quite cost effective in terms of if we think about other types of regulatory regimes. Yeah.
I just add one thing, actually this labeling, I'm just giving you an example of bio-based plastic, because bio-based plastic should be really good, right? So, simple. But but if you look at life cycle assessment, and because you actually look at the indirect effect, of course, in terms of the carbon emission, that should be engineered environmental impact. But if you actually look at basically what does that mean in terms of land use, what does that mean in terms of the other materials, even the fossil fuel, because it's heated actually somewhere, and also competition with food and bioenergy, because there's a certain capacity of production of crops which actually can be used also for bio-based plastic. And then at the end of the day, even there are lots of certification eco-label for bio-based plastic, although it's not only 2% of the whole plastic market at least in the EU. It's not much. But this is really misleading, because actually in this life cycle assessment they actually don't take into account all the aspects, like also indirect aspects. And also this is one challenge. So basically that might apply to palm oil as well, or maybe is as straightforward as some other cases like energy. The other one is what was mentioned. Is it the calculation we do? Should it be production based or consumption based? Because if it's consumption based, basically if it's production based, then we actually kind of
I'll just very quickly say about, it might be that this is a sort of a symptom of trying to push everything in the world into categories of good, not so good, okay, bad, really bad. And some of the stuff just isn't going to work because of those trade-offs, whether it's carbon or biodiversity. Do you care more about the percentage of carbon dioxide or what it might do to some orangutans? Or, so I should completely off the top of my head maybe have labels which are showing that this product is really good, it's local, it's seasonal, it hasn't required any extra heating or lighting to grow it. You couldn't buy food in the supermarket that's got a lower environmental impact. On the other side, this has been flown in on a refrigerated plane from the other side of the world. Maybe don't buy this 3 times a week. Don't know.
Yeah, definitely agree with like summing it all up into one letter just kind of overlooks a lot of, so there's different, you could have it broken down into like different categories.
Yeah, great. I think we have time for 2 more questions. Okay, shall we ask the gentleman in here?
I think you raise his hand first.
The last 2, okay.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. I have a question about crop engineering, and it has to do with the legislation. So the question is whether the current legislation, I'm thinking of Europe, I guess globally, is hindering development in the field, in terms of incentives. And then related to this, I guess, there seems to be a mismatch between the perception in crops engineering between academics and the general public. So I was wondering whether you think that the current level of cross-communication between academia, the public, and the legislation is currently sufficient.
Yeah, since it's about legislation, so the Genetic Technology Precision Breeding Act 2023 as an enabling piece of legislation to harness innovative technology, which can have really as well implications for dealing with climate change. I'm a bit concerned that the government is having as an introduction to say this is about reducing regulatory burdens. So this is a classic example of the United Kingdom using the powers that it now has after Brexit to chart its own path, separate from the EU authorization system that we had before in the UK as well for the GMOs. And I'm a bit concerned to say that it's this greatly regulatory project, and it's good for the proportionality principle, because the argument, of course, was to say that it shouldn't matter really what method is being used, as long as the outcome is similar, i.e. the organism produced is one that could have been as well produced by conventional breeding techniques. That's what we really should be focusing on. And that has some logic. But I think what it overlooks is that once you start to deregulate significantly, as this piece of legislation really does, it makes the possibility to use these organisms, to release them and to market them potentially a bit easier. And I think as you do that, you may perhaps as well reduce public trust. And that has as well an impact in the end if you have markets for these products. So I think one shouldn't be too quick with the deregulation and to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but to recognize that legislation that has stringent authorization procedures as well enables to create trust in these products that are perceived by some people as risky as well. And I thought it was quite telling that in the consultation exercise, a significant number of the population, I think the figure was 78% of the respondents to that particular consultation, and 67 so it was 78, I think, of individual citizens, 64 of businesses, thought that the risk from these gene-edited products would be the same as for GMO, and that we should still have the same regulatory regime around it. So we can see that there's not an easy public consensus for easing off on the regulation in one sense. So yeah.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a gulf still between academic opinion about these technologies and public. It's definitely changing though. I have worked with I've done some GM and gene-edited crop trials, and we got basically no pushback at all from the public. We had some letters from a number of GM protest groups. They were all from the same template, so they all raised exactly the same concerns. Greenpeace were approached for comment, and they said this is no longer a priority for us because look at everything else that's going on in the world. Farmers have approached me and asked if we could do gene-edited crop trials on their farms. They're really open to this new technology. And I think there's a sort of a policy situation I read about where when something becomes legal, suddenly public perception of it thinks, oh, actually, that must be okay then. And a kind of an unknown distrust of something. You know, you think, well, they're banned, that must be because they're bad. Now they're legal, well, they're probably fine then. So, yeah, I don't know, there are a number of academics who don't want to work on these plants because they don't see an end goal. You know, they don't think it's worth developing that technology because it's not going to go anywhere. There are others who think, I've got genes I know will do stuff, we can engineer them, and then the market will probably have decided that that technology is fine by the time. It will take 20 years to get plants ready from discovery to selling it to a farmer, so yeah, I think they'll be ready by the time it gets there.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, it's a lady. Have you seen this here?
I was just wondering, since Eleanor, you were saying one of the biggest challenges was the availability of data, and I was just wondering if that was in regard more to companies and big farmers and industries not being willing to provide data, or if that was more of they themselves have not calculated and are not necessarily aware of their carbon emissions, and if it's more of kind of malintent, or if it's just they aren't aware, or they don't necessarily want to spend the time and resources on helping to solve the issue.
I feel like, I don't know, other people might also have some insights to it, but I'm not hugely aware of exactly what the problem, but I think it's a mixture of both. From what I'm aware of, lobbying is definitely, lobbying exists whereby information is blocked. I'm not sure, I don't understand why, but that definitely exists. So that could be, I suppose even things like back of packet ingredient information, if you think about it, that's kind of like a trade secret, recipe. If you know exactly what composition of a biscuit, you could just make it yourself. So that's probably part of it. And then in terms of the second part, maybe organisations do have that information, but they don't have ways to calculate it, so they're not going to disclose the information. I think, so depending on the size of the organisation, so there's, I think in the UK and the US, there's a mandate for companies over a certain size to disclose certain pieces of information in their ESG reporting. So that means that they do need to at least report on certain aspects. But in terms of the type of data that I'm specifically in progress talking about with kind of backpack ingredient plus supply chain information, that's probably not encapsulated in what's required from them to disclose. So then it's not publicly available. So maybe there's a space for policy to incentivize that kind of reporting a bit more, because in light of how useful that would be. And farmers are.
I'll just throw another excuse to talk about fertilisers for a bit. So farmers will take advice from agronomists. The farmer doesn't know which chemicals are currently available off the top of their head. They don't know how bad this disease might be in the future, but an agronomist is somebody who will go around and work with a lot of different farmers, advising on which chemicals to use for which diseases or nutritional deficiency or otherwise. A lot of those agronomists work for, surprise, surprise, the companies that sell those chemicals. And so their advice is going to be, oh, well, you definitely want to put something on there. Just to be sure, put something on. Yeah, so that the lobbying issue that you raised, I think really is a problem everywhere, not just policy decision making from consumers, but also for producers. It's everywhere.
Yeah, and I think we see that it's very interesting in documents we can access, for example, around debates around the production of pieces of legislation. One can trace back about how different groups are representing their particular interests in these debates. And I think ESG reporting is lots to be said for it. It can create transparency, and particularly I think it can become powerful as well when it's driving investment. So the reporting needs to go somewhere and has impact in one of the ways as well if investors become really sensitive in terms of what type of businesses they invest in.
I actually work with accounting data, and then actually want to add one more thing to working with data. Even publicly available data is actually the credibility of the data. For example, when we actually work with the officials of different countries, and then we use publicly available data like the FAO food balance sheets, then they have a problem because the governments or authorities or statistical offices in that country, they actually don't regard that data as a kind of a credible data. So even the public available data, which we actually are working with when we actually go to different countries and we have an issue with that. And basically, it starts always with that. And of course, if your base data is not validated by those local governments, then any simulation, any analysis you do, that would be also an issue. So data always is an issue. Even when you think that data is available at the national global level, the credibility of data, especially when we actually working with social economic matrices, which basically summarizes the economy of each country, and then some of the countries actually they update it like every 2-4 years, but some developing countries they already did it like 20 years ago, and they simply update it. So not really creating a new database, but updating. Basically, simply it means that the structure of their economy 20 years ago is still in that table. They just updated some trade data, for example. So these are the issues. I mentioned that that's a big challenge for us. It's also a big challenge because it's sometimes for the simulation model we do or the policies. Otherwise, we actually do instead modeling is garbage in, garbage out. So that's also validation of data as an issue.
Great, I think that's all we have time for. But yeah, could you please join me in giving everyone a warm round of applause? First of all, thank you to Trinity College and to Ian Hewitt for booking this fantastic building. The seminar, I think it really worked really well in this building. Speaking of the building, this time next week, there's another one of these Grand Challenges seminars. It's Science Inequality Across the Globe, in this very same venue at exactly the same time next week. So do please all come and join. I also have to say thank you to all of my committee members who were incredibly helpful with putting it all together. And last but not least, in fact, perhaps most of all, to Victoria Forth, our department administrator, who helped with all sorts of parts of the organisation. So yeah, once again, a very big round of applause. Thank you very much. cafeteria, which is just behind this building. So yeah, it's easy.